When you get to be my age, you've seen enough cycles that very little surprises you anymore. I've watched empires rise and fall, bubbles inflate and burst, new eras announced and then quietly buried. And you know what still fascinates me, even after almost a century? How a culture like Japan quietly built enormous wealth not by working themselves to death for higher salaries, but by changing the way they lived, the way they thought, and the way they made tiny decisions every single day. Let me tell you, that's a lot closer to how I got rich than whatever your favorite finance influencer is shouting about this week. You know what people always assume? They think wealth comes from some big secret, some magic stock, some hyper-sophisticated formula. They want fireworks, they want drama, they want cleverness. But most enduring wealth, mine included, comes from something much more boring: discipline, simplicity, and a stubborn refusal to be stupid for a very long time. I've said all my life that being rational is a moral duty. You should never be more stupid than you absolutely have to be. And when I look at these Japanese habits people love to talk about today, the money journals, the no-waste mindset, the small daily improvements, the contentment with enough, what strikes me isn't how exotic they are. What strikes me is how rational they are. They read just different cultural packaging for the same principles that made my life work. Let me tell you how I see it. And if you listen closely, you'll notice something important. None of this requires you to be a genius. It just requires you to stop sabotaging yourself every day. One of the Japanese ideas I like is this habit of actually writing down where every dollar goes. They have a fancy name for it, but at bottom it's just a written record of reality. I remember when I was a young lawyer in California, I didn't have an app. I didn't have spreadsheets. What I had was a pencil and a pad. I wrote down what came in and what went out. And you might say, Charlie, that sounds tedious. But you know what? That's really tedious. Waking up at 65 and realizing you have no idea where the last 40 years of income went. When you put numbers on paper, reality stops being fuzzy. You think you re-good with money, and then you see in black and white that you re-hemorrhaging cash on nonsense. Little leaks that collectively drown you. People like to pretend they forgot. The human mind is very good at selective amnesia, especially around our own stupidity. Ink does forget. Once you see it, you can unsee it. And the moment you can unsee it, you start changing it. That S not an app feature. That S human nature. You know what else is baked into that Japanese money journaling habit? A simple question. How can I improve? Not how can I be perfect by next Tuesday? Not how can I become a millionaire overnight? Just how can I be a little less stupid this month than I was last month? That's exactly how compounding works. Every tiny improvement is like adding a small extra turn to the snowball. You keep rolling that thing long enough. Suddenly the size shocks everyone. Except you. Now, let me tell you about another principle that lines up almost perfectly with how I've thought my whole life. They have this deep cultural disgust for waste. Food, clothing, objects, nothing is supposed to be thrown away without a fight. There's even a word for the emotional discomfort of waste. Well, I don't speak Japanese, but I've felt that discomfort my whole life in a slightly different way. Every time you waste money, you are stealing from your future self. When I was coming up, nobody was handing me guaranteed riches. We were all clawing our way up from pretty modest beginnings. It was obvious to people back then that if you threw things away, if you didn't extract full use from them, you were just being an idiot. Somewhere along the way, a lot of modern societies decided that replacing things constantly was a sign of success, newer, shinier, bigger. If it's not new, it's a problem. The Japanese, for all their own follies, kept a better instinct alive: respect for resources. Think about your own life for a second. You know how much food you've tossed in the trash this year. You know the clothes still sitting there with the tags on, the gadgets you never really use. Nobody has to tell you. Imagine if all that waste had been funneled into simple, boring investments for the last 10 or 20 years. You'd be living a very different life. The market does care whether the money came from a brilliant idea or from not throwing out perfectly good leftovers. It compounds just the same. Let me tell you another Japanese idea people love to quote, Kaizen, tiny constant improvements. Americans like to take that and turn it into a motivational poster. The Japanese built Toyota with it. I built my life with a similar idea decades before it was trendy to slap Japanese words on PowerPoint slides. I've said many times, spend each day trying to be a little wiser than you were when you woke up. Do your job a little better. Fulfill your obligations a little more reliably. Slug it out 1 inch at a time. That Kaizen with a Midwestern accent. It's not glamorous. It doesn't fit neatly into a get rich in 90 days course. But you stretch that behavior over 60 or 70 years, and the result looks a lot like brilliance from the outside. I remember people asking Warren and me, what was the big move, the big turning point, the one trade? They want a dramatic story. The truth is deeply unsatisfying to people who want drama. The big move was thousands of tiny decisions, reading instead of watching television, thinking instead of reacting, saving instead of spending, saying no to 99 out of 100 temptations, and being willing to look stupid for years while other people chase the fad of the month. The Japanese also talk a lot about purpose. This reason to get up in the morning idea, they tie it to work, to meaning, to longevity. And if you strip away the poetic language, the point is deadly practical. If you don't have some organizing purpose, your behavior will get hijacked by every short-term impulse. Your spending becomes a coping mechanism instead of a deliberate choice. I've watched that play out my entire life. People who hate their work tend to spend more to compensate. They buy status symbols to justify the misery. They take expensive vacations to escape a life they built themselves. It's astonishing the more they try to cover the emptiness with consumption, the emptier they feel, and the cycle continues. Let me tell you something that would horrify a lot of lifestyle bloggers. There's nothing wrong with a life that is, by outside appearances, quite boring, a modest house, a car that is good enough, not something you brag about, routines that are predictable, work that is often tedious but aligned with your strengths and values. That boring life lived consistently is one of the greatest wealth creation machines the world has ever seen. Contentment is almost subversive in modern culture. The Japanese have this notion of finding beauty in imperfection, in the worn, in the simple. I am not particularly poetic, but in my own way, I've always believed something similar. You don't need the newest, the fanciest, the flashiest to live well. In fact, I've watched the pursuit of flawless perfection, perfect houses, perfect wardrobes, perfect social images, destroy both bank accounts and sanity. I remember couples who spent fortunes trying to constantly upgrade everything in their lives. Kitchens redone every few years, cars swapped out long before they were truly worn out, constant redecorating, endless consumption. They thought they were living well. What they were really doing was turning compounding in reverse. Every dollar they spent chasing an unattainable ideal was a dollar that never got the chance to quietly multiply in the background. Now, let me shift to something that gets closer to the bone, self-restraint. People talk about grit and hustle and working 90 hours a week as if that's the pinnacle of virtue. The Japanese approach that interests me more is their cultural comfort with patience, with enduring discomfort, with not immediately satisfying every craving. I've watched experiments where children are offered one marshmallow now or two if they wait. We know decades later, the kids who can wait tend to do better in life. It's not because marshmallows cause success. It's because the willingness to endure a little discomfort today in exchange for a better tomorrow is a superpower. The stock market, business, marriage, health, everything important rewards that ability. You know what modern consumer finance is designed to do? Destroy that ability. Buy now, pay later. Zero down. Treat yourself, you deserve it. The whole system is calibrated to separate you from your future, and if you go along willingly, Don't be surprised when your future is very pleasant. IV lived long enough to see entire nations rebuild themselves on the back of collective restraint. Japan did it after the war. They accepted hardship, saved aggressively, worked methodically, and invested in productive capacity. That's not romantic. That's arithmetic. Meanwhile, IV also watched societies try to vote themselves rich, borrow their way to prosperity, and pretend trade-offs don't exist. That never ends well. There's another Japanese concept people romanticize. The idea of repairing things with gold, turning a crack into a feature instead of a flaw. Again, strip away the cultural poetry and you get something brutally practical. Fix what's broken and use it longer. Don't throw everything away the moment it chips. This applies to objects, but it also applies to careers, to habits, to investment strategies. You don't need to burn your life to the ground every time something breaks. You don't need a new identity every 2 years. Very often, the right move is to repair, to learn, to improve, not to replace. IV made plenty of mistakes, some quite large. I didn't respond with reinvention every time. I responded with analysis. What exactly did I do that was stupid? How do I change that behavior so I don't repeat it? IV said I like rubbing my own nose in my mistakes because it forces better thinking. That's psychological repair with gold. The scar remains, but it becomes part of something stronger. Now, you might be thinking, all right, Charlie, this all sounds very philosophical. What does this have to do with my money between now and, say, 2026? Let me connect the dots for you. I can predict specific years, never could, never pretended to. But I can tell you with complete confidence that markets in the next few years will behave like markets always have. There will be stupidity. There will be periods where asset prices detach from reality. There will be manias where people think the old rules no longer apply. There will be panics where they rediscover gravity in an extremely painful way. If you find yourself in something that looks like one of those everything always goes up phases again, you'd better remember a few things. First, you are not obligated to participate in every mania. You're allowed to look at something, say, I don't understand this well enough, and sit on your hands. That simple act, doing nothing when everyone else is doing something dumb, is one of the purest minimalist habits there is. Warren and I have been through episodes where everyone around us seemed to be getting richer faster. Tech bubbles, real estate crazes, financial engineering fads. We looked slow. We looked old. Some people thought we'd lost our touch. Then the tide went out, and it turned out a lot of those people were swimming naked, to borrow one of Warren's better lines. We hadn't lost our touch. We had just refused to abandon rationality. Second, in any future period that looks frothy, I want you to remember that one of the great defenses against any kind of financial turbulence is not having a lot of silly needs in your life. If your monthly expenses are inflated by status purchases and constant consumption, you will be fragile in any downturn. If you arrange life so that you can be content, truly content, with less, your resilience goes up dramatically. If markets in 2026 looked anything like some of the more cartoonish periods IV lived through, the people who get hurt worst will be the ones with leverage, with high fixed costs, with identities tied to looking rich instead of being rich. The people who will weather it best will be the ones who practiced quiet habits long before the storm, low spending, high savings, simple portfolios they actually understand, and lives built on something sturdier than quarterly statements. Third, and this may sound almost too simple to be valuable, in any uncertain future, the advantage will belong to the people who keep learning while others are merely reacting. I've said that in my whole life. I've known no wise people who don't read all the time. None, zero. The Japanese have their ritualized ways of continuous improvement. Mine is a chair, a good light, and a pile of books. When some future upheaval comes, and it will, the people with the best odds are those who understand a little bit about a lot of important things: psychology, basic accounting, incentives, history, a little engineering, a little biology. The way systems break, that's a multidisciplinary toolkit. It helps you distinguish between temporary volatility and permanent impairment. It helps you avoid the very worst mistakes, which is where most of the game is actually played. People love to think in terms of tricks. They want 9 tricks, 10 hacks, 20 rules. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Japanese habits you find so alluring, the so-called minimalist rules you want on a checklist, and the ideas that guided my own life are all just reflections of the same small handful of principles. Live below your means. That's the no waste, no silly, needs idea. Focus on what you can actually control and ignore the noise. That's the patience and acceptance at the heart of those cultural sayings. Continually improve your judgment so you can avoid big mistakes. That's Kaizen with a different label. Build a life that would still feel meaningful, even if your net worth dropped by half that. Purpose and contentment, not consumerism. None of this is new. None of it is fashionable. But all of it works. Let me pull this together in a more personal way. I remember sitting in rooms in the 1970s, the 1990s, 2008 periods when it felt like the world might actually go insane for good. I remember seeing people who had chased complexity leverage fashion. They were very impressive in good times. Brilliant, even when the music stopped. A lot of them had nothing real underneath the facade. At the same time, I knew people, and UV never heard their names, who quietly had enough cash, simple holdings in understandable businesses, low expenses, and lives that weren't built on showing off. They weren't on television. They weren't teabagging at country clubs. They didn't look like heroes in boom times. But when the storm hit, they didn't flinch. They didn't have to sell at bad prices. They didn't have to panic. That's what quiet, habit-driven wealth looks like from the inside. So, if you're rethinking about the years ahead, maybe worried about 2025 or 2026 or some data pundit told you to circle on your calendar, here's what I'd suggest. Stop looking for prophetic certainty. You get it. Stop looking for one big move. You don't need it. Instead, look at how you live Tuesday afternoon, Thursday morning. Look at where your money actually goes. Look at the decisions you make when you're bored, stressed, or envious. You don't have to copy Japanese culture, or mine, or anyone. But you would be very wise to adopt the underlying logic. Waste less, want less, think more, act more slowly, repair what can be repaired, ignore what you can control, and do all of that for decades. If the future throws another once-in-a-lifetime market event at you, and it will, you need a prediction. You have something much better, a life and a financial structure that are inherently robust. You have cash because you didn't waste it. You have options because you didn't lock yourself into high fixed costs. You have clarity because you didn't drown your brain in noise. You have patience because you practiced it daily on all the small things. You know what most people never quite grasp? Quiet habits are not small. They are everything. They are the architecture underneath every overnight success you think you see. The Japanese understood that well enough to rebuild a country from rubble. I understood it well enough to go from a young lawyer to someone you apparently willing to listen to for this long. So if you remember anything from this old man rambling about Japanese habits and future markets, let it be this. You don't have to be brilliant, but you do have to stop insisting on being stupid. Pick a few simple, rational ways of living and stick to them longer than is comfortable. Let everyone else chase the next big thing. Your job is to quietly become the kind of person who will be fine in almost any future, 2026 included. That's not glamorous. It win you arguments on the internet, but it will, over a lifetime, quietly make you rich in money, in options, and in the only wealth that really matters at the end, a life you not ashamed to look back on.